Accusations are flying between the U.S. and China after a dangerous near collision between warships from both sides. The incident happened during a joint naval exercise between the U.S. and the Canadian Navy in the Taiwan Strait.
And Paula, that's so common when we see encounters between the Chinese and the U.S. military, two entirely different narratives of what happened. From the U.S. perspective, it was a U.S. Navy ship, a destroyer, the USS Chenghu, sailing with a Canadian ship through the Taiwan Strait, which under international law is...
Video showing the near collision was captured by a news crew on a nearby ship. You can see the Chinese destroyer cutting across the front of the U.S. ship. CNN Pentagon correspondent Oren Lieberman is with us. Oren, both sides.
A routine humanitarian mission turned into a high-stakes collision in the world's most contested waters. The BRP Suluan was simply escorting food and fuel for
is an international waterway. Sailing through that when, according to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a Chinese Navy vessel or Chinese military vessel cut 150 yards in front of the U.S. ship and then circled back.
There's great risk to safety, the safety of mariners. We don't seek a confrontation with China, but those mariners out there were clearly acting in an unsafe way. We were operating in the international laws of the sea, the rules of the road.
And cut 2,000 yards in front of that ship. Again, from the U.S. perspective, it is China here that is to blame for what they called an unsafe maneuver.
Until a Chinese Coast Guard cutter moved in with water cannons capable of breaking windows and tossing sailors overboard. What Beijing didn't expect was that its aggressive maneuver would put it directly in the path of a U.S. destroyer. The resulting crash wasn't just an accident, it was a military miscalculation that may alter the balance in the South China Sea. What comes after impact? Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. Do you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. A water cannon meant to force back a 44-meter patrol vessel.
From this perspective, it's almost as if they're describing an entirely different encounter. China's defense minister, speaking at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore just hours after this happened, said as the U.S. says, and what's allowed there. The U.S. and others view that as international waterways. We saw the same sort of disagreement just a couple of weeks ago over the South China Sea when a Chinese fighter jet intercepted. The U.S. wasn't there for peaceful purposes. They were looking there for a provocation by sailing through the Taiwan Strait, and that gets to a disagreement about simply the rules of the road.
Instead set off a chain of mistakes that even Beijing did not plan for. The Philippine ship BRP Suluan had been on a straightforward mission, escorting small cargo boats carrying food and fuel towards Scarborough Shoal. These boats were not transporting weapons or military supplies, but essentials for local communities. The Suluan's role was limited: keep commercial vessels safe from interference and ensure they reached Filipino fishermen who depended on those deliveries. Nothing about the assignment suggested confrontation until a cutter from the Chinese Coast Guard appeared on the horizon. The ship that intercepted them, hull number 3104, was not an ordinary patrol boat. Built to military standard.
A U.S. reconnaissance aircraft there. Once again, U.S. said it was an international airspace and had the right to be there under international law. China, however, said it was essentially encroaching upon Chinese sovereignty. So there you see the disagreements. Well, General Mark Milley gave a speech just a short time ago at what's known as the Iron Mike Memorial from the D-Day invasion, the landings here that led to the liberation of Europe in World War II.
It was larger, heavier, and carried more powerful equipment than the modest Philippine vessel. Within minutes of closing the distance, its crew brought high-pressure water cannons into play. These were not the kind of hoses used by police during crowd control. They blasted pressurized water at a velocity that could knock sailors to the deck, damage hull plating, and shatter glass. Witnesses from past encounters describe windows popping inwards and equipment being torn off deck mounts under the sheer pressure. For the Suluan, which had only light arms and a modest crew, this sudden aggression moved the standoff beyond routine intimidation. As the two vessels struggled for position, the Chinese cutter made a move that proved disastrous. In an attempt to cut across the Philippine vessel's bow and prevent further escort, the captain of 3104 initiated a sharp maneuver. It was the kind of tactic aimed at boxing in a smaller ship without actual collision. But while executing that turn, the crew lost awareness of the bigger picture. A United States destroyer had been shadowing the area as part of a freedom of navigation mandate. The destroyer's presence was not unexpected. American warships had been maintaining a steady rotation through the region. What nobody anticipated was how fast 3104's maneuver would carry it into the destroyer's path. The Philippine patrol vessel measured only 44 meters in length. By contrast, the Chinese cutter displaced around 1,500 tons of steel. That alone made its sudden movement dangerous enough. But when several thousand tons of American warship were already moving on steady bearings nearby, the situation became unmanageable. The destroyer had seconds to react, and warships of its size and design cannot pivot like speedboats. Each knot of momentum requires careful calculation to arrest. In this situation, the Chinese vessel's rapid slide into its track left no space for either side to yield. Steel collided with steel, delivering an audible impact across the contested waters. This was not an isolated case of recklessness. Analysts note that over 10 accidents in the past 5 years showed a repeated breakdown between China's Navy and its Coast Guard. Reports frequently point to issues of coordination, where Coast Guard cutters pressed aggressive tactics without real-time awareness of Navy vessels or other regional traffic. The pattern reveals more than just human error. It reflects the rushed effort to deploy as many platforms as possible across the South China Sea, often overcrowding restricted waters. Each added vessel increased the chance of mishap, and the 3104's collision with a U.S. destroyer became the clearest evidence yet of that risk. What makes this incident so damaging for Beijing is the symbolism. Gray zone tactics, designed to pressure rivals without open war, rely on tight control. Every maneuver is meant to intimidate opponents, but stop short of outright disaster. Yet this time, the very strategy meant to broadcast power-triggered global headlines about lost control. Instead of Manila or Washington appearing cornered, it was China that looked reckless. A supposed show of dominance was transformed into a public blunder played out on international news feeds. Far from discouraging rival claims, this spectacle revealed how fragile these tactics become in congested waters. The misstep underscores a deeper flaw. Ambition in the gray zone works only while opponents believe risks are contained. Once actions spill into collisions with allied ships, the story changes. Suddenly, questions about safety and escalation dominate discussions, robbing Beijing of the narrative it wanted to project. What started as an attempt to intimidate a small Philippine escort ship ended with China's own vessel colliding against the most modern naval fleet in existence. It was ambition colliding with reality, and the sound of that impact traveled far beyond Scarborough Shoal. And this was only the beginning, because the moment American steel absorbed that collision, Washington moved from monitoring to responding, turning a local clash into a test of global resolve. One reckless maneuver in crowded waters exposed how fragile China's intimidation tactics really are. By colliding with a U.S. destroyer, the cutter turned a routine act of pressure into a demonstration of weakness, and the presence of allied vessels showed how quickly balance shifts when partners act together. If a single cutter can create global headlines and force Washington's response, the stakes rise dramatically whenever destroyers and carrier groups shadow each other across the South China Sea. The question now hangs over